Okay. Well, let me begin. As I thought about how I might prepare for today's presentation, I wonder what kind of people are likely to come to a panel on a snowy Saturday morning to talk about issues of race. And I assumed, and I think quite correctly, that most of the people would be people of faith. And I see a lot of ministers and reverends. And so I anticipated that today I would be preaching to the choir, as we call, to people who already know, to people who already understand. And so, with that in mind, I thought I would tailor my talk today to really prepare us for the work that we have to do, to reach the people who are not here, and to do the work that this task force was designed to do. So I'm going to focus really on the role of religious institutions as relates to both race and racism, and creating the problem and as being part of the solution. And that is the focus of my talk today. The reason I said we're going to move beyond blame and pity is because there's been a lot of discussion about race, particularly in recent months. And some people avoid these conversations because they're afraid that it's going to talk about unpleasant things. And people have a natural inclination to avoid pain. And so they don't want to talk about things that might be unpleasant or disturbing. Or they're afraid, kind of intuitively knowing without knowing, that when they talk about these things, it's going to be blaming people and blaming white people and blaming America. And they don't want to do that. Or they could be liberal progressives, like many of my friends and colleagues, who kind of understand this and doing these activities and going to these lectures and marches and different things like this becomes an affirmation of our beliefs, which is very good. But sometimes it ends at a level what I call pity, just sympathy, empathy. And I don't want to say just, but it doesn't translate then into action. And so today I want to kind of move beyond pity and beyond blame and get an understanding of how we arrived in this position from people of faith, to look at it the same way we would look at an individual with a problem, is the same way we would address societal problems, and the same way we would go about healing in a spiritual sense, what we would call in our various faith traditions atonement, is a good model for collective atonement of a society. And so those are the kind of ideas that I want to start with. And I'm going to take us through this, maybe a little fast, but there's going to be time for questions. And I will make these slides available to Sandy, but you can take notes if you like in a class, and you could put questions in the chat room. And I'm sure Mrs. Dickinson or someone will be following that, and we'll make sure we try to get your questions answered either at the end of the presentation today, or I'll follow up and contact you later if it requires a longer explanation. But we can look at this purely politically, which is one way, but as people of faith, I look at these problems as a source of evil, and as not only injustice, but as sin. And so, what are the wages of sin, the cost of the kind of things that we have done as a society? Often people focus on, white privilege. For those of you familiar, and I assume again in this group, people have heard that term before, white privilege. The consequences of racism, right, which is not just a feeling or attitude, right? It is an institution. It has a purpose, and the purpose started out primarily to produce economic benefits, right? So slavery, the reason for slavery is to force people to work without pay, right? That produces profit. And so that is the economic benefit. And that accrues and continues through various forms of discrimination. Also, socially, it elevates the people in one group, in this case, the white group, above other people. And although this isn't material, it's psychological, social, that you feel superior. particularly, in the ages of segregation, just doing simple things like, getting on a bus, drinking from a water fountain, using a public restroom. We say things like whites only. And so if you drank from that water fountain and you felt like this is a special water fountain, this is the VIP bathroom, this is the reserved section of the bus for special people. And so almost your every action affirmed your superiority and your greatness. These are the two kind of primary privileges of whiteness in a racist society. And this is why it was very difficult for people wanting to give up either of these things. And many of them persist in various forms even today. Less discussed, but equally important, I think, to the privileges is the damage that it has done, not only to the primary victims of these actions, Black and brown people. What I'm suggesting today is that it also damages the white larger society. So the wages of sin, these are the benefits, but also damages. And what is the damage? From a spiritual sense, I would say it damages the soul to benefit and participate in these kind of things. It also corrupts the institutions of that society that could normally be noble institutions, could be religious institutions, could be principles. All of that is undermined by these kind of actions. And then lastly, it mocks God. For those of us who, believe in faith, that these two things are incompatible to the God we serve in all of our various religious traditions, that racism mocks God. And we cannot combine both of these things at the same time, as we have done for so many centuries. Okay? And so I'm going to proceed and just show how that really occurred in Western society. The year 1492, and I'm going to go through this quickly, both as a historian, but as a theologian, as well as an important year, important for us here in America, because that's the year that Christopher Columbus came to the Western Hemisphere, and America developed from that. But also theologically, as many of the reverends and priests would know, this is an important year in Christian history because this is the start of the Spanish Inquisition, that period, of reclaiming and expanding Christianity, which Spain had been ruled by the Moors, the Muslims of North Africa, for over 500 years. And so in 1492, when Ferdinand and Isabella, the king and queen of Spain, took over, they said, we're going to bring about a new era in Christian history. And that led to the expulsion of all Jews and Muslims from Spain. Inquisition, the word is to inquire, right? But it was actually very brutal in terms of, are people really practicing the faith or not? And the painting that you see there is Christopher Columbus in front of Ferdinand and Isabella. Columbus, as you may know, was not Spanish. He was Italian from Genoa. And his approach to the king and queen of Spain was, I have an idea of how to make Spain wealthy by finding a trade route of commerce to India and China. And also he appealed to their religious fervor. And he told them, in addition to making Spain rich, I will also help spread the faith of Christianity. And almost like a, kind of used car salesman, this really appealed to them and really moved them in a deep way, and allowed many of them to finance his various voyages to North America. So this was part and parcel. I'm going to do two things. I'm going to make you rich, and I'm going to spread the faith. And so I have a quote here from the New Testament, actually. It says, for what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? And so these two things, they will conquer the world and spread the world and discover much of the world, from their perspective. But in the process of this discovery and expansion, did they lose their soul in a sense? We see this even in this painting. You see these are some of the slaves, Native Americans, that Columbus brought back after his first voyage to prove he actually gone someplace and came back. And he brings these slaves back with them. Say, here are some of these native people that I brought, and we're going to introduce Christianity to them. One of the earliest priests in this story was a Dominican priest by the name of Father Bartholomew de las Casas. He lived from 1484 to 1566. And he was one of the first priests in what was called the New World. And he was very active in introducing Christianity to the native peoples of the Caribbean and of South America. And while he's there on these islands, the document I'm going to read from is from his letter to the King and Queen of Spain and to the Pope about what he's observing on the island of Hispaniola. Today, that would be the Dominican Republic in Haiti. And he's there on that island, and he's doing his job. He is introducing Christianity to the native people. But he's also observing what the conquistadors, this is the term we use to describe the other Spaniards, you can hear the word conqueror in that, what the conquistadors are doing to the native people. And he really complains, and I'm very proud of him as I read this passage, as an advocate to say, what I'm trying to do here on the island and what the conquistadors are doing is completely incompatible. I'm trying to introduce them to Christianity. And if these are the first Christians these people are ever meeting, and I'm telling Christianity is a religion of peace and love, and they see the examples of what these men are doing, they may doubt or wonder what kind of faith, what kind of religion do these people have based on their actions and behavior. And this is what Father Bartholomew wrote. Of course, it was in Spanish. I'm reading the English translation of it. But this is what he wrote in 1542. Among these gentle sheep, referring to the native people, gifted by their maker with the above qualities, the Spaniards entered as soon as they knew them, like wolves, tigers, and lions, which had been starving for many days, and since 40 years have done nothing else, nor do they afflict, torment, and destroy them with strange and new and diverse kinds of cruelty, never before seen, never heard of, nor read of. The Christians, with their horses and swords and lances, began to slaughter and prance strange cruelty among them. They penetrated into the country and spared neither children, nor the aged, nor the pregnant women, nor those in labor, all of whom they ran through the body and lanced, as though they were assaulting so many lambs herded into the sheepfold. They made bets as to who could slit a man in two, or cut off the head at one blow. Or they opened up his bowels. They tore the babes from their mother's breasts by the feet and dashed their heads against the rock. Others they seized by the shoulders and threw them into the river, and laughing and joking as they fell into the water, they exclaimed, "Boy, oh baby," and so on. They spitted the bodies of babies together with their mothers and all of who bore them on their swords. They made a gallows high enough for the feet to nearly touch the ground, and by 13s, in honor of reverence of our Redeemer and the 12 apostles, they put wood underneath, and with fire, they burned the Indians alive. He goes on with this, but I think you get a sense. And so he is writing with great detail, right? So we can't say that people didn't know what was going on, right? There are always people of conscience who are present and who are trying unsuccessfully in Father Bartholomew's case to stop it, but he's speaking out. He's writing back to his church. He's writing back to the political leaders of his day, informing them of what's happening and how what they're doing is undermining what he is trying to do as a priest in that community. The only satisfaction he gets is they try to put kind of semi-limits on their behavior, and saying that you must first give people an opportunity to convert to Christianity. And then if they refuse, then you're allowed to do these things. But you have to allow them, and they would read these proclamations in Spanish. But this continued, particularly South America. I'll say this with regard to the Catholic Church, is they did try to make a distinction between heathens, pagans, and Christians. And that because these people were not Christian, we could do this to them, and we actually would ultimately be doing them a service, a benefit, because we would be bringing them to Christianity. And so that was supposed to be the redeeming aspect to this. So this distinction, I put here in the slide, this is maybe the first mistake in our faith traditions when we began separating souls from the physical bodies of those we serve or seek to serve. So to say, well, my goal is just to save their souls. What happens to their bodies? Well, that's not my concern, right? And so we as people of faith cannot and should not separate, as they did, right, the spiritual needs from the living conditions of the people we serve. And so we see this a few weeks ago. I was happy to be with the Moravians, and we looked at the history of the Moravian church, who also went to the Caribbean as missionaries. And they would convert slaves, African slaves, in St. Thomas and other places. And they told the slave masters, we're not here to interfere with slavery. We're here to save the souls of your slaves. And they said, as long as you're not going to interfere with the institution, you can go ahead and preach whatever you want. And so this separation, which we've often done, separating our faith and limiting ourselves to the spiritual domain and ignoring or condoning the social, the political, and the economic. Moving closer to home here in America, maybe closer to home to you and your church, when you look at the history of the Anglican Church, in contrast to the Catholic Church, the Catholics, at least initially, tried to make this distinction between heathens and Christians. And you could treat heathens a certain way, but you couldn't do this to Christians. And so they don't really make an effort to introduce Christianity as vigorously, because once they become Christian, they're supposed to be treated better, and they should have certain rights, and they should be, for instance, in the Catholic Church, when they would marry a couple, they would say, well, God has joined together, let no man tear asunder. So their marriages would be protected by the church if they had a Christian marriage. And then one of the justifications for discrimination and enslavement in particular, that the heathens would be taken away if they become Christian. Right? So now you can no longer say, I'm doing this to people because they're not Christians. They're African heathens, they're native. Now they're Christians, so you can't continue to exploit them in that sense. So this became a problem, one issue here in North America. And in 1667, the Anglican Church, the dominant church during the colonial period in North America, passed slave codes as slavery is being institutionalized. It was a practice. The first Africans arrived in America in 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia. And we don't believe they were initially treated like slaves. They were treated like indentured servants. They were worked, but then they were given their freedom like other white workers. They acquired land here in America. And so as America gradually, over a period of decades, start to practice and define legally what slavery is, the question came up, well, what about Christian? What if they become Christians? And so you have missionaries early on, and then you have a period called the Great Awakening, particularly Methodists, who go about converting slaves to Christianity. And so the question became, if they became Christians, could we still own them and treat them like slaves? And in 1667, the laws were passed saying that, quote, baptism does not change the slave status. Baptism meaning introduction to Christianity. So if they do become Christians, they can still be slaves, and it will have no effect on their treatment. And this, I think, is profound to say Christianity has no effect. You can still own them, because if the law was you can't do this to Christians, right? As Christians, we cannot treat other Christians this way. This would be a violation of all of our principles, all of our teachings. I mean, I'm a Jew, but I've read the New Testament, particularly that passage where Paul says there's no east or west, no north or south, but we're all one in the body of Christ. Here he's referring to discrimination among Christians, particularly the early Jewish founders of the church, who discriminated against Gentiles, right, who were coming, those who Paul was going around converting and bringing them in, and those who were born Jewish, like the disciples, said, well, these people who weren't born Jewish, they're not the same. We won't eat with them, even though we all kind of share this faith. And Paul was saying, we should all be one. There shouldn't be any distinction, Jews, Gentiles. We're all Christian within that. Well, here, this is a kind of contradiction of Christians now to get to the point where they would say that it is permissible for a Christian to own another Christian as a slave. And this is what happens, and it's condoned. There's a great book on Christian slavery for those of you who want to expand this further. And then within the Episcopal denominations, you have these are two people who you should know. I think Reverend Absalom Jones on your right and Richard Allen on the left. Absalom Jones was born a slave in Maryland in 1746. He purchased his wife out of slavery because the law was that a slave would take the condition of the mother. So whatever the mother was, if the mother was a slave, the child would be a slave. And so by making her free, that meant their children would be free. Then he gets his freedom. He moves to Philadelphia. He joins a Methodist Episcopal church. And he and Richard Allen leave that church as the church begins to institute within the church among free people practices of racial discrimination, saying that the Black members of the church would have to sit in the back or this balcony, and they would receive communion only after the white members were able to come up. And Absalom Jones and Richard Allen were so insulted by this discrimination within their church that they left the church and started their own congregations and denominations. In 1774, he founds the Black Episcopal Church. And in 1802, he is the first Black priest ordained by the Episcopal Church of the United States. And this was his kind of experience, but yet these Black ministers had to start their own congregation because there was so much racism and discrimination within their own denomination. Richard Allen would not only start a church, but he starts the African Methodist Episcopal Church today, which is it's not a church, it's a denomination, over 5 million members around the world. Most African Americans either Baptist or Methodist, and it starts that way because of the discrimination in the church. And to this day, Sunday morning is the most segregated day in American life, where most Black people still worship in Black congregations. And the reason for that and the origin of that goes back to these practices, which still persist today. And this is the origin of it. Okay, I'm going to move on, although I think I see some questions there. Now, this month we're celebrating Black History Month, and last month we celebrated Martin Luther King's birthday. And I found a little known clip of Martin Luther King addressing the role of theology as a foundation of racism. And it's only 2 minutes, so I can try to play it for you. The speech is longer, but the clip where he talks about this is only 2 minutes, and that's the part that I'm going to play.
Seems to be a fact of life that human beings cannot.
We can't see it. Oh, there we go. There we go. Sorry.
Reaching out for some thin rationalization to clothe an obvious wrong in the beautiful garments of righteousness. This is exactly what happened during the period of slavery. Even religion and the Bible were misused in order to justify slavery and crystallize the patterns of the status quo. And so from some pulpits it was argued that the Negro was inferior by nature because of Noah's curse upon the children of Ham. Then the Apostle Paul's dictum became a watchword: servants, be obedient to your master. And then one brother had probably read the logic of the great philosopher Aristotle. You know, Aristotle did a great deal to bring into being what we now know as formal logic in philosophy. And in formal logic, there's a big word called a syllogism, which has a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. So this brother decided to put his argument for the inferiority of the Negro in the framework of an Aristotelian syllogism. He came out with his major premise: all men are made in the image of God. Then came his minor premise: God, as everybody knows, is not a Negro, therefore the Negro is not a man. This is the kind of reasoning that prevails.
Okay. All right. So I thought this was very profound, and looking at the underlying logic or illogic, really, of racism, and how so much of it was based on an interpretation of the Bible, which says in Genesis that all men are created in the image of God. And then they flow from that and say, well, God is not a Negro. Therefore, the Negro is not a man. And once you place people outside the normal boundaries or definitions of human beings, then your values as to how you treat a human being doesn't apply to them. And they do this from, as he says, all men are created in the image of God. God is not black, therefore black people are not human beings. And King really, kind of explained that. I thought that was very profound. Now, I could go into this more deeply, but for those of you who are wondering, what does he mean? What's the evidence for that? What do you mean, that, God is not black and black people are not created in the image of God? This was very clear and well understood to Martin Luther King and to black people in general. I'll just give you a sense of this. As I said, this is from a whole nother presentation where I go into much deep. But this is, Michelangelo's famous, the creation mural of God, who's depicted there as a white man, as he always is, and Adam is white. And all of these images that we've grown up with for centuries, Adam and Eve, Moses, they're all white. Even in sculpture, David. I like this one because it is a painting from the 15th century of the meeting of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. And the passage in the Bible, Song of Psalms, chapter 156, the description that is given there is, I am black but comely, O ye daughters of Jerusalem, as the tents of Kedar, as the curtains of Solomon. Look not upon me because I am black, because the sun has looked upon me. My mother's children were very angry with their vineyards. My own vineyards I have not kept. See, although you have this kind of like description in the Bible, when this artist picks up his paintbrush to paint them, he paints them as white. And this is what Martin Luther King was talking about, this kind of reference that everybody knows God is not black. God is white. All the people in the Bible are white. Even in movies and films, this is the classic 1956 film, The Ten Commandments, where the Egyptians are white, the Hebrews are white, everybody is white. But yet the Ethiopians have a brief cameo in the movie, right? They're presented as black, even though these are neighboring countries in Africa. But the Hebrews, and the Egyptians presented as white. And we see this all the time. That was 50 years ago. This is still going on today, right? This is Christian Bale, and, even in the Bible where you have Zipporah, who's an Ethiopian woman, right? In the movie, she's played by Yvonne DiCarlo, who in real life was a brunette, but in the movie, she has to be like this blonde, Ethiopian, same thing in today in 2013 movie, they had this actress on your right to play the Ethiopian woman. And just to contrast that, I'll show you what a real Ethiopian woman looks like. And so these are the images that we still have. This painter at least painted Zipporah as a black woman, but he still paints Moses as a white man, which makes it an interracial relationship. But he at least realized that in terms of realism, the way we're presenting these were problematic. And then, of course, the most problematic of all is this image of Jesus as a white man with blonde hair and blue eyes. And so when Martin Luther King says, everybody knows God is not a white man. And since man is created in the image of God, God is not black, and black people don't fall into the category of human beings as we understand it through our religious text. Just so that, and this is again going on today, but just so that this is how the Egyptians depicted themselves. We can see how we depict them in our films and our movies and our art and our literature. This is how they drew themselves. So if we go back here, and I am winding down. If we go back, we were at King. So how do we get to healing? And that's what we want to end with. And how do we understand the problem very clearly, I think. I like this passage from the book of Isaiah, where he says, some of you will rebuild the ancient ruins. You will restore the foundation laid long ago. You will be called the repairers of the breach, the restorers of streets where people live. And I think this is the call of our generation. We see the mistakes of the past and all of our various religious traditions, the mistakes that they made in the past, but we are called to be the repairers. We have to repair the damage that was done. This is the difference between guilt and responsibility. So we're going to move beyond guilt, right? We are not guilty of the things that were done centuries ago. We could not be. We weren't even born, right? So we are not guilt. But as Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor, explained the difference between guilt and responsibility. And about the Holocaust, he said, not everybody is guilty, but everybody is responsible. So even if you weren't, one of the people who actively took part, you knew what was going on. And so you are responsible in that sense. And we are all now responsible for correcting the damage, for repairing the breach. Whose responsibility is it to fix what was broken? It is our responsibility. So we may not all be guilty. Some of us might still be guilty, some things, right? But we are certainly all responsible. And we have to take responsibility for correcting the problems of the past and the problems that persist even into the present. How do we do that? Well, this is where I say, we could just draw from our faith traditions. In an individual case, when we become estranged from God, separated from God, right? Then how do we become one again? And that's what the word atonement, I was told when you break it down, it means at one mint, right? So we've been separated, and this committee, is for reconciliation, right? Justice and reconciliation. If we are fragmented people in a fragmented country right now, how do we become at one? Through atonement. And in our individual sense, we would say the process, I think this is probably true in your church as well, the process involves recognition of the wrong that was done, contrition on your part, restitution in some form to repair what was done, active forgiveness on the part of those who were wrong, to forgive the abuse that was done to them, and a commitment not to repeat the sin. Right. So this is what we normally believe, what we would normally practice on an individual level. I'm suggesting this is a blueprint for societal atonement. Right. Recognition, contrition, restitution, forgiveness, and a commitment not to keep repeating the sin. Practical applications of this would be dismantling all racist institutions, right? Shakespeare said that the evil that men do live long after they're dead, but the good is interred with their bones. I'm paraphrasing him, but you've probably heard that, meaning, the people who are most responsible for the racist history and society that we live in today, those people are long dead for the most part, right? But the evil that men do, Shakespeare said, lives on long after they're gone. But the good is often interred with their bones, meaning good intentions. We take our good intentions with us to the grave. But people who have bad intentions, they act on their evil. Right? They do things that live on and continue on even after they're dead. Whereas people who have good intentions, that often just take those good intentions with to them grave. So we have to actively dismantle racist institutions. We have to purge our minds, our habits, our traditions, and our patterns of behavior. And we have to upset the status quo, which is racist in its history and practice. We have to, again, like Jesus said, we have to turn the tables, right? Flip over the tables on these things. That is how we will achieve racial healing and reconciliation. Here in the Lehigh Valley, I'm just going to give you some practical things of what could be done. We still, have patterns of racial discrimination throughout the Lehigh Valley. These were intentional. I mean, here in Bethlehem, we moved here in 2005. In 2008, I was volunteering for Barack Obama's first presidential campaign. And I expected to go out like with a clipboard and register voters in my neighborhood. We live in West Bethlehem. And the Democratic Party gave us a list where they wanted the volunteers to go. And they said, no. There are large concentrations of Democratic voters in these places. And they sent me to places and parts of Bethlehem that I had never been. And I discovered that there are large Black populations back there on the South Side, and like these mini housing projects over here and there. And the people who designed it with racial intent. I'm sure if we were starting over again today, we would not create a segregated society. But the segregated society was already there. So we have to dismantle it. So fighting the lingering forms of residential discrimination and overemphasis on policing in our community, right? The police reflect our fears, and we're afraid of the people who we have segregated. And so the police serve a function in society to protect white society from Black and brown people. And this is why people in those communities don't feel the police are there to protect them. The police are there to control them and there to keep them subordinate. And so we have to change that. Educational disparities that are allowed to persist. And even in our places of worship that still resemble the days of segregation. As I said, I was talking about the 19th century Richard Allen and Absalom Jones and separate black and white churches. Well, today, I mean, you don't have formal segregation, but you still have black and white churches, even within the same denominations. And obviously the healthcare disparities that disproportionately affect people of color, from the current COVID crisis to diabetes to cancer to infant mortality to every form of healthcare. We know that these things are going on, and this is a problem. And so these are just some obvious and immediate practical things that we could do to bring about racial reconstruction and reconciliation. I'm going to leave you with some books that you could read if you want to follow up on these. They're very popular now. You can find them in any bookstore and on Amazon. But How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi is excellent, and it's a short book. White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, a white woman writing to a white audience. And what she calls fragility, why people don't want to talk about and come to these panels and come to these workshops and talk. They're so fragile when it comes to dealing with issues of race. And Eddie Glaude's new book, Begin Again, which is really, exploration of James Baldwin. But I like, the term comes from a phrase from one of James Baldwin's essays, where he says, we have no choice but to begin again. What can we do? We have to begin again. We have to start over. We can't go back, but we can go forward. And so we have to begin again. And so I would recommend any or all of these books to people who want to explore it further. And so with that, I want to thank you for your attention and turn the program back over to our moderators for questions.